The gown arrived on a Thursday. I remember because Thursdays were always inventory day at the Whitmore Grand. My hands spent the morning counting vanilla pods and weighing sugar in the kind of meticulous quiet that pastry work requires. By afternoon, I'd moved on to prepping the chocolate fondant for the weekend's dessert service, telling myself the rhythm of work could crowd out everything else I'd been trying not to think about. It couldn't. Vera from wardrobe knocked on the kitchen door at 2:30, carrying a dress bag over her arm and wearing the expression of someone delivering news they didn't ask to deliver. "Mr. Altman needs you at the gala tonight," she said. "Simone went home sick. He says you're the only one who can present the dessert course without embarrassing the hotel." I stared at her. "I'm a pastry chef." "You're also the only person on the floor who can explain a 12-layer meal file without calling it a fancy cake." She held out the bag. "It's a size 4. Simone pulled it from the VIP wardrobe before she left." I took it. The bag was heavier than I expected. I'd worked at the Whitmore for 5 years, long enough to know which guests required extra attention and which ones preferred to be left alone. Long enough to recognize the difference between a standard corporate event and the kind of evening where the wrong fork placement became a conversation that reached the general manager's desk by morning. Long enough to understand that the Whitmore Charity Gala was not the kind of event where a pastry chef in flour-dusted clogs belonged, no matter how good her fondant was. But Douglas Altman was my boss, and my boss had asked, and I owed Douglas more than I could easily explain. I carried the dress to the changing room on the 4th floor and unzipped the bag. The gown was the color of a deep winter lake, midnight navy silk, with a fitted bodice and a skirt that pooled at the hem like something designed to make a woman feel like she belonged somewhere better than where she'd started. I hadn't worn anything like it since my cousin's wedding 3 years ago, back when my life still felt like it had a predictable shape. I undressed carefully, hung my chef's whites on the hook behind the door, and pulled the gown over my head. It fit, better than it had any right to fit something borrowed from a woman 2 inches taller than me. I stood in front of the mirror and didn't quite recognize the person looking back. Not Jenna Caldwell, the pastry chef who arrived at 4 in the morning and left smelling like caramelized sugar, but someone composed enough to stand in a room full of Chicago's wealthiest donors and not apologize for being there. I was still studying my reflection when I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. The 4th floor housed the hotel's premium suites. It was quiet up there, deliberately so. Guests paid for the silence. I shouldn't have been there at all, except Douglas had sent me specifically because the wardrobe room was on that floor. I assumed I was alone. I wasn't. I opened the door to check that the hem wasn't dragging and found Lucian Thorne standing 6 feet away, his key card in hand, clearly on his way to suite 412. He stopped. I'd seen him before. Anyone who worked at the Whitmore for more than a month knew what Lucian Thorne looked like. He was in the Forbes 400. His picture appeared in the Tribune's business section, with the reliable frequency of bad weather. Thorne Capital had backed 3 of Chicago's largest urban development projects in the past decade, and the hotel itself had benefited from his investment group in ways Douglas never publicly specified, but also never denied. What the Forbes photos didn't capture was that he was taller than he appeared in print, or that without a jacket, he was carrying his draped over one arm. His presence took up more space than a man standing still should reasonably take up. He looked at me the way I sometimes looked at a finished dessert I hadn't been sure would work, with the careful expression of someone recalculating everything they'd assumed. "I'm sorry," I said, because it seemed like the right thing to say when a stranger caught you standing in a hotel corridor in a borrowed gown. Vera from wardrobe sent me up here to change. For the gala, I'm presenting the dessert course." He didn't respond immediately. "Does it look ridiculous?" The question came out before I could stop it. "On a pastry chef, I mean. I don't normally." I gestured at myself, at the silk, at all of it. Lucian Thorne looked at me for a moment longer, and then he said, "No, it doesn't look ridiculous." Something about the way he said it, quiet, deliberate, like the words cost him something, made me look away first. The gala was beautiful in the way expensive things are always beautiful. Flowers that cost more than my rent, candles on every surface, a jazz quartet playing something plaintive and low in the corner of the ballroom. I presented the dessert course to 4 tables of donors and managed not to embarrass Douglas, which was the goal. I described the millefeuille. I answered questions about the chocolate source. I smiled until my face ached. I saw Lucien Thorne twice across the room. Both times he was already looking in my direction. I told myself it meant nothing. The offer from Harlan came the following Monday. His full name was Harlan Vick, a name I'd heard around the edges of Chicago's development world for a couple of years. He wasn't in Lucien Thorne's league, but he had money and ambition in roughly equal measure, and he'd recently broken ground on a boutique resort in Miami that was, by his own description, going to redefine the Florida luxury hospitality market. He'd contacted me through the hotel's event team, asking if I'd be available to consult on the resort's dessert program. I'd met him for coffee, expecting a professional conversation. What he offered instead was a 3-year exclusive contract as the resort's head pastry chef and culinary director, full relocation package, a salary that made my current number look like a rounding error. And he would cover my father's medical bills, all of them. My father's name was Ray. He was 61 years old, a retired postal worker from Evanston, who'd spent 30 years on his feet in all weather and had the joint damage to prove it. The kidney disease had shown up 2 years ago, quiet at first, then increasingly not. His nephrologist at Northwestern had recommended a treatment protocol that his insurance classified as experimental, which meant it was also, in their terminology, uncovered. The out-of-pocket cost was $178,000. I had $22,000 in savings, my father had less. Harlan slid a folder across the table. "I know about your father's situation," he said, in the tone of a man who'd researched this carefully. "I have connections at Northwestern Memorial. The treatment can begin within 3 weeks of you signing. You'd be in Miami by the end of the month." I looked at the folder. I didn't open it. "Why me?" I asked. "Because you're the best pastry chef in Chicago under 40, he said. "And because you're not attached to anything here that matters more than your father's life." That last sentence sat in the air between us like something neither of us wanted to name directly. I told him I needed time to think. He gave me 2 weeks. The days that followed had a particular quality, like standing at the edge of something and not being able to see the bottom. I went to work. I made croissants and tarts and a birthday cake for a guest's daughter that she called the best thing she'd ever eaten. I called my father every evening and listened to him tell me not to worry, which was what he always said, which was why I always worried more. I didn't tell anyone about Harlan's offer. Not Vera, who was my closest friend in the building. Not Douglas, who would have had opinions I wasn't ready to hear. I was in the hotel's main kitchen on Wednesday evening, the last one there, piping ganache onto Petit's fours for the following morning's breakfast service, when I heard the kitchen door. Lucien Thorne was not a man who came to the kitchen. In 5 years I had never seen him below the 3rd floor. He was still in a suit, charcoal, no tie, the collar button undone the way it had been the night of the gala. He stood in the doorway and looked at the kitchen, the way people who have never worked in one tend to look at kitchens, with the mild surprise of someone realizing how much machinery exists behind the quiet elegance they've always taken for granted. "Mr. Thorne," I set down the piping bag. "Can I help you with something?" "I heard you're considering Harlan Vick's offer," he said. The kitchen felt smaller. "Where did you hear that?" "Chicago is a smaller city than people think." He moved inside, stopping at the stainless steel island across from where I was working. "He's been telling people he's already locked down the Whitmore's star pastry chef. I wanted to find out if that was true." "He's premature," I said carefully. "Are you considering it?" I picked up the piping bag again because I needed something to do with my hands. "That's not really your business, Mr. Thorne." "No," he said. "It's not. Don't sign it." I looked up. His expression was the same one he'd worn in the corridor outside Suite 412, controlled, precise, with something underneath it that he was choosing not to name. "Harlan Vick isn't what he presents himself as. The Miami project has 3 active investor disputes, and a contractor who filed a lien last month. Whatever he's promised you. He's promised to cover my father's medical treatment. The words came out flat, factual. I hadn't meant to say them, but there they were. Something shifted in Lucian's face. How much? 178,000. He was quiet for a moment then. Tell me about your father. It wasn't what I expected him to say. I told him anyway. The kidney disease, the insurance denial, the nephrologist who'd said the treatment protocol had an 80% success rate in patients my father's age and profile. The number that had been sitting in my chest for 2 months like a stone I couldn't put down. Lucian listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, I can have the treatment funded by Friday. I stared at him. I don't understand. I sit on the board of the Northwestern Memorial Foundation. There's a patient assistance fund for exactly this kind of coverage gap. Your father's case qualifies. He said it the way he probably said everything. Direct, without softening. I should have flagged this sooner. I didn't know. You didn't know, because it's not your business. My voice came out sharper than I intended. Why are you making it your business now? The question sat between us. Because Harlan Vick made it mine, he said finally. He came to me 3 weeks ago, before he approached you. He wanted capital for the Miami project. I declined. He told me he'd find another way to make it work and mentioned you specifically. Said he had the right leverage. The muscle in his jaw tightened slightly. I didn't understand what he meant until tonight. The understanding moved through me slowly. Then all at once, Harlan had known about my father, had researched me, had found the one thing I couldn't say no to and built an entire offer around it. He was using me, I said, to get back at you for declining. He was using your father's illness, Lucian said, which is a different thing, and a worse one. I set the piping bag down again. My hands weren't entirely steady. Why do you care? I asked, the question I'd been circling. About the Whitmore, maybe, but about me specifically. Why does it matter to you whether I sign his contract or not? The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigeration units hummed. Outside, somewhere on Michigan Avenue, a cab honked. Because I've eaten your desserts for 5 years, Lucian said. And that's not it. But it's where I'll start. He looked at me with the same unsettling directness he'd had in the corridor. The look that didn't flinch away and didn't try to cushion anything. And because I've been looking for a reason to have a conversation with you that didn't involve asking for the check. I didn't know what to say to that. I'll have Douglas's office confirm the foundation contact by morning, he said, retreating to safer ground. Don't make any decisions about Vic until you've spoken with them. He left the way he'd come, quietly without ceremony, the kitchen door swinging shut behind him. I stood there for a long moment, then I went back to the Petits Fours. My hands had steadied. The call from the Northwestern Memorial Foundation came at 9 the following morning. The patient assistance coordinator walked me through the paperwork with the efficiency of someone who did this often, and I found myself wondering how many other people Lucian had quietly routed through this same process without anyone knowing the source. I called my father that evening and told him we'd found a way. He cried. I held the phone and listened and didn't let myself cry until after I'd hung up. Then I called Harlan Vick and told him I wouldn't be signing. He was not gracious about it. He mentioned the expenses he'd incurred on my behalf. He mentioned conversations he'd had, connections he'd leveraged. When none of that produced a different answer, he said, "This is Thorne, isn't it? He got to you." "No one got to me," I said. "I made my own decision." "You're making a mistake." "Probably," I said, "but it's mine to make." I was shaking slightly when I got off the phone, not from fear, from the specific relief of having said something true. I went to find Lucian. His office was in a building on Wacker Drive, with a lobby that made the Whitmore look modest. His assistant, a composed woman named Glenda, looked at me with the polite skepticism appropriate to someone who turned away uninvited visitors for a living. "Jenna Caldwell," I said. "From the Whitmore Grand. He'll want to know I'm here." She made a call. A minute later, she showed me to a corner office on the 22nd floor. Lucian was at his desk, jacket off, reviewing something on 2 screens simultaneously. He looked up when I walked in, and something in his expression settled. the particular look of a man who'd been waiting to see how something would turn out. I told Vic no, I said. I know, he called me. A faint expression, not quite a smile but close. He had some things to say. I imagine he did. I sat down across from him without being invited, because I wasn't in his hotel anymore, and formality felt like the wrong key for this lock. You paid for my father's treatment and told me not to sign a contract, and then walked out of a kitchen without explaining yourself. I think you owe me a complete sentence. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, You started at the Whitmore 5 years ago. The first week, you made a tart tatin for Sunday brunch that I ate 3 pieces of, which is not something I typically do. I asked Douglas who made it. He told me your name. I waited. 4 years ago, the Whitmore nominated 3 junior staff for the Illinois Culinary Arts Foundation scholarship. You were one of them. You didn't get it. The selection committee went with a candidate from a larger program. He paused. I thought that was the wrong decision, so I funded a separate grant through my family foundation. It went to the runner-up from that round. The air shifted. That was me, I said. The scholarship I'd used to attend a 2-week intensive in New York. The one I'd been told came from an anonymous donor who believed in supporting mid-career culinary talent. The one that had paid for the training that had ultimately gotten me promoted to head pastry chef. That was you. It was an anonymous grant, he said. It still is, as far as the foundation's records are concerned. Why, my voice was quieter than I intended. He was quiet for a moment. The city spread outside his windows, Lake Michigan in the distance, all gray and enormous and restless, because the committee was wrong, and because I had the means to correct it. A pause. And because I wanted to. You wanted to help a pastry chef you'd never met. I wanted to help someone with a talent that deserved better than being overlooked because of committee politics. He met my eyes directly. And I hadn't met you yet, but that was a choice I'd been making deliberately. Because you worked at a hotel I had a stake in, and because I have rules about the kind of complications that creates. The parallel landed in my chest before I could stop it. Years of careful distance, a choice, not indifference. Rules, I said. Rules, he confirmed, which I've been finding increasingly difficult to maintain since a Thursday evening 3 weeks ago, when you asked me if a gown looked ridiculous on you, and I couldn't manage to say anything useful for approximately 10 seconds. I looked at him. He was watching me with that careful expression, not guarded, exactly, but precise. Like a man who'd measured the distance he was about to cross and was committing to it anyway. It didn't look ridiculous, he said again, in case there was any ambiguity. I thought about 5 years of working in the same building. Elevator rides where he'd been present but professionally unreachable. His name appearing on hotel correspondence I'd processed without examining too closely. 4 years of believing a scholarship had come from a stranger who happened to believe in me. You've been watching out for me, I said, for years, without saying anything. Yes. Why didn't you say something sooner? He looked at me steadily. Because you were building something. A career that belonged entirely to you, that you'd earned on your own terms. I didn't want to complicate it by making you feel that your position here depended on my interest in you. His voice was even, but I could hear what was behind it. And because I was afraid of what it would mean if I was wrong about how one-sided it was. It wasn't one-sided, I said. The stillness in the room changed quality. I used to look for your name on the reservation list, I admitted. When Douglas would send over the VIP guest schedule, I'd see Thorn L and decide what I was going to make for that evening's dessert service. Not because you'd ordered anything specific. Just because I wanted it to be worth eating. I paused. I told myself it was professional pride. I lied to myself pretty consistently. Something eased in his expression. Not dramatically. Lucian Thorne wasn't a man who did anything dramatically. But the careful precision shifted slightly. Became something warmer underneath it. Jenna. My first name in his voice sounded different than it did anywhere else. What do you want to do about this? I want to have dinner with you, I said. Not at the Whitmore. Somewhere neither of us is on duty. Friday, he said immediately. Monteverde. I know the chef. Of course you do. "And I want to resolve the foundation paperwork for your father before then," he continued, and the practical precision of it, the way he could hold the romantic and the logistical in the same hand, without either diminishing the other, was so exactly him that I almost laughed. His first treatment appointment can be scheduled for next week, if that works for his calendar. "I'll tell him," I said. "Good." He stood, which in that office was the equivalent of taking a step toward someone. "And for what it's worth, I'm sorry I waited this long. That was cowardice dressed up as professionalism, and you deserved better. You funded my career development anonymously and quietly fixed my father's healthcare crisis without asking for anything in return," I said. "I think the timeline is forgivable." Something that was absolutely a smile crossed his face then, brief, real, transforming. I filed it away. Something told me I wasn't going to see it often enough to waste one. Friday dinner was everything two people can be, when they've stopped pretending they don't notice each other. We talked about food and architecture, and a book we'd apparently both read the same winter, in different cities, without knowing it. He was funnier than I'd expected. Dry, quick, the kind of humor that doesn't announce itself. I told him about growing up in Evanston, about learning to bake from my father's mother, about the summer I'd decided this was the only work I'd ever want to do. He told me about his own family, his late mother, who'd been the pragmatic one, his father, still alive but declining, living in a facility in Lake Forest. He told me about the business he'd inherited at 31 and spent 15 years building into something his mother would have approved of and his father would have considered excessive. He called me Sunshine for the first time that evening, without announcement, when I described the scholarship trip to New York. The one he'd funded without my knowledge, the one that had changed my trajectory. "Only you," he said, "would spend a week in New York City eating exclusively at places you'd researched for their pastry programs." I had very specific priorities. "You did," he said, "Sunshine." I looked at him. "The way you talk about it," he said simply. "It's the right word." I didn't argue. My father's first treatment session was on a Tuesday. I drove him to Northwestern, sat in the waiting room, reading a magazine I didn't absorb, and thought about how 6 months ago this had seemed like an impossible problem and was now simply a Tuesday appointment, an item in the calendar, a thing that was happening because someone had quietly made it possible. Lucian texted at 11, "How is he?" I wrote back, "Good," holding my hand and pretending he doesn't need to. A pause then. "That's what fathers do. Tell him I said so." I looked at the message for a long moment. Then I showed it to my father, who read it and looked at me over his reading glasses, with the expression of a man who had questions he was choosing not to ask yet. "He sounds like a sensible person," my father said finally. "He is," I said. "He's also somewhat terrifying." "Good. Terrifying and sensible is a good combination. Your grandmother would have approved." I put my phone away and held my father's hand in the waiting room of a hospital he could afford to be in, and thought about how strange and specific the path had been to arrive at this particular Tuesday. A borrowed gown, a corridor outside a hotel suite, a question about whether something looked ridiculous, and a man who'd said no, it doesn't, with an honesty that cracked something open I hadn't known was closed. The nurse came out to update us. The treatment was going well. I called Lucian from the parking garage afterward, leaning against my car in the cold November air, the kind of cold that smells like lake water and approaching winter. "Good news," I said when he answered. "Good." His voice carried that particular quiet I'd come to recognize as relief showing up without announcement. "Dinner tonight? Not Monteverde. I'll cook." "You cook?" "Badly," he said, but with conviction. "That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me." A pause. "Sunshine." "Yes?" I've wanted to say something for a long time. Another pause. Shorter, more deliberate. "Come to dinner tonight and let me start making up for the years I spent not saying it." I looked at the gray November sky above the parking structure and felt something warm and certain settle in my chest. Not the anxious warmth of hoping, the settled warmth of knowing. "I'll be there at 7, I said. And I was.